I need you to stop whatever you are doing right now, because what I am about to tell you is not something I have ever said out loud in its entirety. Not to a therapist, not to a detective, not to the judge who sat across from me in that courtroom and asked me to speak clearly for the record. This is the first time I am saying all of it in order, from beginning to end, because I have spent 4 years deciding whether the world deserved to hear it. And I have finally decided that the answer is yes, not for the world, but for you specifically, the person watching this right now, the person who clicked on this video for a reason I may not know, but that I suspect has something to do with darkness, with a door that will not open, with a silence that has lasted too long. My name is Sarah. I am 28 years old. I live in a small apartment in Nashville, Tennessee, with a cat named Bowie, and a plant I keep forgetting to water. And on most mornings, I drink my coffee on my balcony and watch the sun come up and feel something that I can only describe as the particular fragile beauty of being alive when you were not supposed to be. 3 years ago, I was held captive in Los Angeles, California, for 183 days, 6 months, by 5 men who took me from a sidewalk in the middle of the afternoon, who demanded $1 million from my family for my return, who subjected me to things I will not fully describe, but that you will understand from the shape of what I leave unsaid, and who were never going to let me go. Nobody came for me. The FBI had a case file. My mother had done interviews on local news in Ohio, holding up a photograph of me from Christmas the year before, her voice breaking on every syllable of my name. My best friend had covered every telephone pole in East Hollywood with flyers. People I had never met shared my face online and wrote prayers in the comments. And I was still in that room. I want to be completely honest with you about that, because the story you are about to hear is not a story about being saved. It is a story about saving yourself. And those are different stories. And the difference matters enormously, and I will tell you why before this video is finished. But first, let me take you back to the beginning, to the Tuesday in March that changed everything, to the grocery bag that hit the sidewalk on Vermont Avenue, to the moment when ordinary life ended and something else entirely began. I had moved to Los Angeles 3 years before it happened, at 21, with 2 suitcases, a communications degree from Ohio State, and the specific kind of confidence that belongs only to people who have not yet been seriously hurt by the world. I was from a small town in Ohio, the kind of town where everyone knows your family, where your mother's coworkers ask about you at the grocery store, where safety is so ambient and assumed that it becomes invisible, the way oxygen is invisible, the way you do not think about breathing until you cannot. I had gotten a job as a production assistant at a small video production company in Silver Lake, found an apartment in East Hollywood with 2 roommates I eventually became close friends with, bought a secondhand couch and a turquoise lamp and a cat I named after David Bowie because I was 21 and it seemed like the right thing to do. I jogged in Griffith Park in the evenings. I went to the farmer's market on Sunday mornings. I called my mother every Sunday night at 8 o'clock without exception. This was an agreement we had made when I left Ohio, a small ritual that she held on to, I think, as a way of managing the particular anxiety of a parent whose child has moved across the country. I was happy. I was building something. I was so entirely unprepared for what was coming that I could not have prepared for it, even if someone had tried to warn me. Because the thing no one tells you about danger is that it does not arrive with warning sounds and darkening skies. It arrives on an ordinary Tuesday in the middle of a golden afternoon while you were thinking about what to cook for dinner. March 12th. I had left my apartment around noon to walk to the corner store, a 10-minute round trip, a route I'd walked dozens of times, a route so familiar I could have walked it blindfolded. I bought milk, bread, pasta, a bottle of sparkling water. I checked my phone at the register. 12:41. I had a work call at 1. I had time. I put the phone in my jacket pocket and picked up the paper bag and walked out into the Los Angeles afternoon, into the jasmine and exhaust smell I had grown to love, into the particular quality of Southern California light that turns everything slightly golden in the middle of the day. And I was thinking about the call, and I was thinking about the pasta, and I was not thinking about the black van that had been idling 2 blocks down the street, or about the fact that it began to move when I came out of the store, or about anything at all that was about to happen to me. They had been watching me for approximately 2 weeks. I learned this afterward from the investigation, from the things the FBI pieced together and eventually shared with me at my request. They had identified me through a combination of circumstances I still find random and horrible in equal measure. I had been at an event, a small industry networking gathering at a bar in Koreatown, and one of the men had been present, and something about me had caught his attention. And within days, there were people following me, cataloging my schedule, noting my route to the corner store, determining the window of time when I was most likely to be alone on a street without significant foot traffic. They chose me deliberately. They planned it carefully. They were not amateurs. The van pulled alongside me on Vermont Avenue, and the door opened, and there were 2 of them immediately. One from behind, who got his arm around my waist before I even registered his presence, and one in front, who was responsible for the hand over my mouth, for the pressure that prevented me from making any sound larger than a muffled noise that no one on that street, which was at that moment empty of anyone who might have helped, would have had time to hear anyway. My grocery bag hit the sidewalk. The milk broke open. I remember the sound of that, the particular soft impact of a paper bag on concrete, more clearly than almost anything else about that afternoon. I fought. I want to be clear about that. I kicked and scratched and tried to bite and made my body as difficult to move as I could. And they were stronger, and there were more of them. And within seconds, I was in the van. The door was closing. The engine was accelerating, and a blindfold was being tied over my eyes with a practiced efficiency that told me this was not the first time any of them had done this. Someone hit me, I don't know with what. I never established this, hard enough that I lost consciousness, and the last thing I was aware of before the darkness was the sound of Los Angeles receding, the familiar city going quiet around me, the ordinary Tuesday continuing outside the van windows without me in it, as though I had simply stepped off the edge of the world and the world had not noticed. When I woke up, I was in a room, concrete walls, concrete floor, a mattress, a bare light bulb on the ceiling, the smell of damp and something metallic underneath it, a door with a padlock that I would not touch for 2 hours because touching it meant confirming what I already knew, that I was locked in, that the Tuesday was over, that everything I had been building for 3 years in Los Angeles was on the other side of a wall I could not see past. My wrists had been bound and then unbound. There were red marks, and my phone and bag were gone, and I was still in my jeans and my gray t-shirt and my white sneakers, and I sat on that mattress for what felt like a very long time before I allowed myself to begin thinking clearly. Because thinking clearly meant thinking about what this was and where it might end. And for a long time, I was not ready to do that. They came in that first evening, the leader first, and then the others filtering in behind him, until all 5 of them were in that room with me, and the room that had already felt small became almost impossibly small. The leader sat across from me on a plastic chair and explained the situation in a tone so calm, so businesslike, that for a moment, the sheer mundanity of his delivery was more frightening than anything else about him. Because a person who is calm while explaining your captivity is a person who has done this before, or has thought about it for long enough that it no longer feels extraordinary to him. He told me his terms. $1 million. He would be contacting my family. He told me that cooperation was in everyone's best interest. He used the word cooperation in the particular way that men use that word when they mean something else entirely. And I understood exactly what he meant, and the floor of my stomach dropped through the concrete and kept going. That first night was the beginning of something I do not have adequate language to describe, and I will not try to describe it in full, because this story is about survival and not about the precise anatomy of what I endured. What I will tell you is that the 5 men had roles: the leader who directed, 2 who enforced, 1 younger man who sometimes looked at me with an expression I could not categorize as anything except less blank than the others, and a 5th who managed logistics and rarely spoke. And that within the first 72 hours, I had already begun the process of understanding that no one was coming quickly, that the cavalry was not outside the door, that whatever happened next was going to happen largely on terms that were not mine. I had begun, without naming it, the process of surviving. The days in that room had a texture unlike anything I have experienced before or since, and I want to try to describe it accurately because I think it is important, not for dramatic effect, but because understanding what prolonged captivity does to time and to the self is the only way to understand what it took to escape it. Time in captivity does not move the way time moves in the ordinary world. In the ordinary world, time is reliable. It divides itself into mornings and afternoons and evenings, into the punctuation of meals and activities and sleep, into the rhythm of a week that feels familiar enough to navigate by feel. In that room, time became something else. It pooled, it thickened. Some days stretched into an eternity, long, gray, almost featureless stretches in which the only events were the arrival of food pushed through a slot in the door and the sound of footsteps on the floor above me. Footsteps I had learned by the 3rd week to identify individually, to read the way you read weather, to interpret as signals about what the day was going to bring. Other days collapsed into a blur so complete that when they were over, I could not have said whether 4 hours or 16 had passed. I counted mornings. This was the one act of timekeeping I committed to absolutely. Every morning, the first thing I did upon waking was add 1 to the number I had been holding in my mind since the day I arrived. And this act became a small but critical piece of resistance, a daily insistence that time was still moving, that this situation had a duration, even if I could not yet see its end. By the end of the first month, I had 31 mornings. By the end of the second, 62. I held those numbers the way you hold a railing in the dark, not because you trust it completely, but because it is what is there. The physical conditions of my captivity were, to put it plainly, designed to diminish me. The food was sufficient to maintain basic function and nothing more. I could feel myself weakening across the weeks, could feel the specific weakness that comes from inadequate nutrition, the way it manifests first as fatigue, and then as a kind of cognitive fog that makes clear thinking genuinely difficult. I lost weight I could not afford to lose. Sleep was irregular, partly because of conditions that made genuine rest difficult, and partly because I came to believe, and I believe still, that some of the disruptions were deliberate, a technique as old as captivity itself. Deprive someone of sleep, and you do not need to do much else to compromise their judgment, their resistance, their sense of themselves as competent actors in their own lives. The physical abuse was present from the first week, and never entirely absent across all 6 months, though it varied in intensity and frequency, in ways that I also came to understand as deliberate. The unpredictability itself was part of the mechanism, because a person who knows with certainty when bad things will happen can brace for them, can manage them, can maintain a kind of preparatory dignity. A person who does not know cannot brace, cannot prepare, can only wait and try to keep something intact in the waiting. And then there was the other kind of harm, the kind I referenced in the title of this video, the kind I will not describe in clinical detail, but that I will describe in this way. It was systematic. It was ongoing. It occurred with a regularity that I eventually came to understand as communicative. A daily statement about power and ownership, about what I was and was not, about whether I had a self that was mine to protect. I want to say something directly about this because I think it is important, and I think it often goes unsaid in stories like mine. What was done to me in that room did not take myself. I know that now. At the time, during those months, there were stretches when I believed it had, when I could not feel the outline of myself anymore, could not remember what it had felt like to move through the world as a person with agency and preferences, and the right to say no and have that mean something. The destruction of the sense of self is not metaphorical in situations like mine. It is a real and systematic process, and it works for a time. And then, if you are very fortunate, if something in you holds, it becomes the thing you are rebuilding from. The ransom negotiations were a particular dimension of my ordeal that I will describe because they shaped so much of what the middle months felt like. The leader contacted my family within 48 hours of my kidnapping. I know this because he made me participate in the first call, put the phone to my ear and told me to speak to prove I was alive. I heard my mother's voice say my name in a way that I will never forget for the rest of my life. Sarah? Sarah, baby? 3 words, barely above a whisper, carrying everything she had in them. And I started to say, Mom, I'm alive, And the phone was taken away before I could finish the sentence. $1 million. That was the number. My mother was a schoolteacher in Ohio. My father had retired from a factory job after 30 years. $1 million was not a number that existed anywhere in the world my family inhabited. I learned later, in fragments and then in more complete detail after my escape, that my family had done everything within their power. They had gone to the police immediately. The FBI had opened a case and was actively investigating. My mother had appeared on local news in Ohio and on a Los Angeles morning show, holding my Christmas photograph, her voice breaking every time she said my name. Camila, my best friend, had organized search parties in East Hollywood, had covered the neighborhood in flyers, had started a social media campaign that spread further than anyone expected. People across the country sharing my face, writing prayers in comment sections, tagging news organizations. Strangers who had never met me and never would sent donations to a fund my family had established toward the ransom. And those strangers' generosity was one of the things that sustained my mother through those 6 months. And when I think about that now, it still moves me in a way I cannot fully articulate. The kindness of people who have no obligation to you, but choose to show up anyway. But kindness and love and social media shares, and the efforts of law enforcement, as real and genuine as all of them were, did not find me. The city was too large, the room too sealed, the men too careful. My family managed to gather approximately $200,000, an extraordinary sum that had required liquidating savings and accepting loans from people in their community who could barely afford to give them. And $200,000 is not $1 million, and the men in that room were not negotiating in good faith. They wanted the full amount, or they were not interested in the transaction. At some point during the 4th month, I calculated this later from the timing of the calls I overheard, from the silences and the patterns. The negotiations appeared to break down entirely. A period of several weeks passed in which no calls were made, in which my captivity seemed to shift from a means to an end to something more open-ended, more permanent. And the realization of this was one of the most dangerous moments of the entire 6 months. Because I had been holding on to the end point, The idea that eventually the transaction would occur, that I would be exchanged, that there was a date somewhere in the future when this would end and I would go home. When that endpoint became uncertain, when I understood that I might be in that room not for months more, but for years, something in me that had been barely holding together came very close to letting go entirely. I want to be honest about what the 5th month looked like, because I think honesty about the worst moments is as important as honesty about the survival. By the 5th month, I had been ground down to something I barely recognized as myself. The counting of mornings had become almost automatic, not a conscious act of resistance anymore, just a reflex, the way a drowning person kicks without deciding to kick. I was not planning escape. I was not strategizing. I was enduring hour by hour with a narrowness of focus that excluded almost everything beyond the immediate present. The next meal, the next period of sleep, the next stretch of time that needed to be gotten through. The psychology of this is something I've since studied extensively in therapy, and I understand it now as the brain's attempt to protect itself under sustained, inescapable threat. A contraction of attention and expectation to the most survivable possible scale. It is not weakness. I want to say that again, because I spent a long time believing it was weakness. Spent a long time with the question, why didn't you try to escape sooner? Corroding something in my chest. It is not weakness. It is what a human mind does when it has been in danger for long enough. And yet, there came a night, a specific night toward the end of the 5th month, when something happened that I will not describe in detail, but that brought me closer to death than I had been before. And when it was over, I lay on that mattress in the dark, in the worst physical pain I had experienced in months, and I did something I had not done in a very long time. I said my own name out loud, very quietly, barely a breath. Sarah. And something in me, something I had believed was completely gone, answered back. Yes, I am still here. That moment, that specific, quiet, barely audible conversation I had with myself in the dark of the 5th month, was the beginning of everything that followed. And I want you to understand that it was not dramatic, that it did not feel like a turning point at the time, that the morning after it, I woke up in the same room under the same bulb with the same men moving above me, and nothing in my external circumstances had changed by a single degree. The change was entirely internal, and it was small, and it was sufficient. I began to observe. This is the only word that adequately describes what shifted in me during those last weeks. I became an observer of my own captivity in a way I had not been since the early weeks, before the grinding weight of the months had narrowed my attention to simple endurance. I began to watch. I watched the patterns of the men, when they arrived, when they left, who came alone, who came with others. I watched the sounds of the building, learning to distinguish the specific quality of silence that meant one occupant overhead versus two, the difference between the footsteps of the leader and the footsteps of any of the others. I watched the door, the hollow core interior door with the padlock on the outside that I had looked at every day for 5 months as a fixed and permanent boundary, but that I now began to examine differently, to press and flex very quietly during the periods when I was certain no one was immediately overhead. To understand as a construction of materials that had properties and limitations rather than as an absolute fact of my confinement. The wood around the strike plate was soft. I was almost certain of it. Water damaged, weakened by the same chronic moisture that had created the smell I had been living with since the first day. A door is not a wall. A lock secures a door at one point, but the door is larger than the lock, and the wood around the point of securing can be compromised. I thought about this with the focused attention of someone who has nothing else to think about and everything to lose from failing to think clearly. I thought about it for 3 weeks before I was ready to act. The only object in that room with sufficient weight and force was a chain, one that had been used early in my captivity as a physical restraint, and then removed when I had demonstrated sufficient passivity. I had moved it casually and over several days to a position near the foot of the mattress, where I could reach it quickly in the dark without having to search. I rehearsed the sequence in my mind every night before sleep. 7 steps from mattress to door. Position myself at the angle that would maximize force on the area around the strike plate. Use the chain as a striking implement. Make it count in the fewest possible blows, because every blow made noise, and noise was the variable I could not fully control. I went through this sequence so many times that it became muscular rather than cognitive. Something my body knew, something I could execute without having to think, which was important because I understood that when the moment came, I would be operating on adrenaline and fear, and that thinking clearly in that state was not something I could guarantee. What I could guarantee was that my body knew what to do. I counted down to nothing specific. There was no planned date, no target night. There was instead a set of conditions I had identified as optimal, and I waited for those conditions to align. Reduced presence overhead for multiple consecutive days. Late enough into the night that any occupant was deeply asleep. The leader absent. I had enough experience with the patterns to recognize when these conditions were met, and they aligned on a Thursday night in September. And when I recognized their alignment, I lay on my mattress for an hour after the sounds above went completely quiet, and I breathed, in and out, slow and deliberate, the economical quiet breathing I had learned in captivity. And then I got up. I picked up the chain. I crossed the 7 steps in the dark without a single stumble because I had walked them 1,000 times in my mind. I positioned myself. I took 3 long breaths, and I hit the door. Once, twice, 3 times. The 3rd time, there was a sound I had been anticipating and fearing in equal measure. A splintering of wood that seemed in the terror of that moment louder than anything I had ever heard in my life. I stopped, listened. Nothing from above. Waited. 20 seconds. 30. Nothing. Continued. The 5th strike broke through. The door yielded at the strike plate, swung inward on complaining hinges, and I was through it before it finished opening. Stairs ahead in near darkness. I went up them along the wall, 1 step at a time, pausing between each, listening. A door at the top, unlocked. A kitchen. Dark, cigarette smell, the particular smell of a space inhabited by men who do not clean it. And I did not stop to look around, did not try to find a phone, did not try to take anything, because I had decided weeks earlier that the worst possible decision I could make was to spend any more time in that house than the absolute minimum required to exit it. A back door, deadbolt from the inside. My hands shaking badly enough that it took 3 attempts, and then the door was open, and the September night air of Los Angeles hit my face, and I want to find words for what that felt like, and I cannot. I have tried many times, in therapy, in conversations with the people I trust, in the private space of my own journal, and I have not found adequate language for the sensation of breathing outside air after 183 days inside a concrete room. It smelled like jasmine. It smelled like car exhaust. It smelled like the specific warm dryness of a Southern California September night. And it was the most beautiful thing I had ever experienced in my life. And I ran. I ran without direction for the first several minutes, just away, just distance, just the physical fact of my own body moving through open space at a speed I had not been capable of for 6 months, weakened and malnourished as I was. I fell once on a cracked section of sidewalk and scraped my palms open and got up without registering the pain and kept running. Los Angeles is a city of lights. And even at whatever time it was, 2, 3 in the morning, there were lights in the distance, and I ran toward them. I ran for approximately 8 minutes before I reached a street with moving traffic, and I stood in the middle of it, and I waved my arms at an approaching car until it stopped, and the woman behind the wheel, middle-aged, wearing scrubs, just finished a hospital shift, whose name I never learned, but whose face I have not forgotten and never will, looked at me through her windshield, looked at whatever she saw in my face and my condition and the state I was in. And she did not hesitate for even a single second. She unlocked her doors. She said, "Get in, you're safe." And I got in. And I was safe. She drove me directly to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center without asking me a single question beyond, "Are you hurt?" and "Do you want me to call someone?" The 2 most useful questions, asked with a quietness and a lack of drama that I have since thought about as a model for how to help someone in crisis. The emergency department contacted the FBI. My case was still open, had never been closed. Within 2 hours, a federal agent was at my bedside. Within 4 hours, my mother, who had been called in the middle of the night from Ohio and who had gotten in her car and driven rather than wait for a flight because waiting for a flight would have taken longer, and she was not going to spend a single additional second waiting, came through the door of the hospital room, and I saw her face. And her face was something I have no language for either. It was broken open and whole at the same time. It was grief and relief simultaneously, 2 things that are not supposed to coexist, but that can, that do, that are in fact the defining emotional experience of the kind of return I was making. She put her arms around me and she made a sound. Not words, just sound. The sound of a person who has been holding something impossible for 6 months and has finally been given permission to put it down. I held on to her, and I thought, with great clarity, not triumph, not relief exactly, but clarity. I did this. I did this myself. Nobody came, and I went and got myself out, and I am here. 4 of the 5 men were arrested within 72 hours of my escape. The 5th was found in Arizona 3 weeks later. They were charged with kidnapping, extortion, assault, and multiple additional counts. The legal proceedings took 2.5 years and were their own specific ordeal. I will not describe them in detail now, perhaps in another video. And at the end of them, all 5 were convicted and sentenced to federal prison. That chapter is closed. The chapter that is still open, the one that I am still living, is the one that comes after the legal process, after the hospital, after the initial wave of relief and media attention and the generosity of strangers. The quieter, longer, more difficult chapter of rebuilding. I have been in therapy for 4 years with a therapist I trust with my life, which is not a figure of speech, but a literal and accurate description of my relationship to her. I have health consequences from those 6 months that I am still managing. The body keeps its own records, independent of the mind's recovery. And those records are thorough. I have nights that are not entirely safe. I have moments in ordinary life, a door slamming, a van passing too close on the street, a stranger's hand on my shoulder, that trigger responses in my nervous system that my brain cannot always override. I have rebuilt my relationship with my own body, slowly and imperfectly, and with a great deal of help, and the rebuilding is ongoing. I am telling you all of this, the full truth, including the parts that are not resolved, including the parts that are still hard, because I want you to understand that survival is not a single dramatic moment. It is not the night you pick up the chain and break through the door. That night is real, and it matters, and I am proud of it in a way that I am still learning to hold, without it turning into something else. But survival is also every morning after that night, every therapy session, every time you say your own name in a difficult moment and hear something answer back. What I want to leave you with, the reason I made this video, the thing I want you to carry with you after you finish watching it, is this. If you are in a situation right now that feels inescapable, if there is a room you are in whose walls you cannot see, or a door whose lock you cannot identify, I need you to hear something from someone who spent 183 days in the most literal version of that situation. You are not finished. The door is weaker than it looks. I have been on the other side of it, in the September air, running toward the lights, and I am here telling you that the lights are real, and the woman who will unlock her car is real. And you are still Sarah. You are still here. And persons, even broken ones, especially broken ones, are capable of extraordinary things when they are given back even the smallest splinter of the knowledge that they are still someone worth saving. Save yourself. I will be here when you get out.